are Japanese girls easy, right? So you hear this a lot from foreign guys and even people in Japan, Japanese guys and girls. They'll say, "You're here because Japanese girls are easy," or "What do you think? Do you think Japanese girls are easy?" And the first thing we have to do is separate where you're meeting these girls, right? Are you talking about tourists and people who are outside of Japan, right? Whether they're studying abroad or just visiting another country, those kinds of Japanese women, or when you meet them in those situations, I would say that yes, they're probably somewhat easy, right? They're predisposed to have an interest in foreign things and foreign culture, right? But when you're in Japan, it's a whole nother ballgame, right? And to really understand why there are generally two different types of Japanese girl, and this is making huge generalizations, obviously. This is not always the case. There are going to be exceptions to each rule. But in general, you have to understand sort of the socialization process that happens usually in high school, sometimes before, in Japan, right? So if a girl has what is considered by Japanese beauty standards, an attractive physical body, right, and face, right, and that would be like a small face, chisai kao, right, kogao or something like that, which is a small, like heart-shaped, pointy-chinned, large-eyed face, right, would be considered quite attractive, right? Whereas an usui kao, it literally translates as like thin, as in like thin as opposed to thick or strong. Usui kao would be like typical like Asian look, right? Thin eyes, right? And a kind of a broad, roundish face, right? So depending on sort of their facial type, right, and how attractive they are compared to Japanese beauty standards, which also have been influenced by the West, right? They're sort of divided into two camps naturally. Now, why does that happen, right? If they're the more attractive type, they'll end up going to, they'll get job solicitations constantly from people who are wanting to give them, modeling or talent jobs or work as a hostess, or basically they can make a good living off of just their looks, right? People are constantly wanting to be their boyfriend, they're competing for their time, all of these things, right? So these girls are popular, right? Because they're popular and they realize this at a young age, right? They realize that they don't need to continue studying, right? And they don't need to study English, right? Whereas if they're unpopular, they generally tend to stay on the path towards university, right? So they study more English, they have at least a little bit more interest in the world outside of Japan, right? It's sort of like, if you're getting everything you need, you don't need to look outside, right? If the attractive type of girls, right, they're getting all the validation, jobs, boyfriends, attention, everything they could possibly need from Japanese society. So there's no pressure at all for them to learn English in the least, right? Whereas these other more average or typical looking Japanese girls are a little bit more interested in foreign things. They're not so popular with the Japanese boys, right? So they start looking for acceptance in other places, right? So that looking for acceptance combined with the fact that they need to study a little bit more, so they learn a little bit more English, means that lesser attractive cohort of women has much more interest in foreigners, right? But if you're like me, the type of girls that you like are like the more attractive ones, right? And these ones, I would say, it's much harder to meet and pick up those kind of girls than it is to meet a comparable English speaker, right? Where I can, know the culture and communicate with them effectively, right? If I want to pick up some girl who's already interested in foreign things and speaks a bit of English and has sort of an average, decent, normal, skinny Japanese girl, it's probably not going to be too difficult, right, for me to find somebody like that who I can communicate with. But if you're going after the types of girls who are highly in demand in Japanese society, like the most attractive girls on magazines, girls who work in hostess clubs, right, these kinds of girls are not going to just, when you say hi, they're not going to be like, oh my God, right? So that's really the two sort of different types of Japanese girls, and the relationship between physical attractiveness, English ability, interest in foreigners, right, and their profession, right? So, if you look very normal, average type, like thin, usui kao, sort of Asian, they actually say this too in Japanese, they say Asian beauty, which means, right, like thin-eyed and kind of round face. Like if you look at old ukiyo-e pictures, right, ancient Japanese like pictures, they have like literally drawn with slit eyes, right, and big oval or round faces, right. This used to be the beauty standard, right. So I assume those women would have been attractive then, but now in Japanese society they're not. So they look for affection elsewhere, right? So in short, I guess I would say that no, right? The type of girls that I'm interested in, I don't think they're easy at all, right? In fact, if you're expecting to go to Japan and arrive some sort of like holy foreign god in the land of mass vaginas throwing themselves at you, I think you're going to be sorely disappointed coming to Japan, actually, right? You're going to realize that you do actually need to understand the culture. You need to understand how to relate to Japanese women, how to understand their values and their interests, right? And they're not always going to be the same. In fact, most of the times they're not going to be at all the same as what you might find with a Western girl, right? And the other unique difference is that Japan, unlike other countries, like especially Southeast Asia or something like Thailand or the Philippines, if you want easy, go to Thailand, go to the Philippines, right? It's very easy, pretty much like picking up a girl's like walking down the street and like walking to the grocery store and being like, I think I'll have these apples today or these oranges, right? I'm exaggerating, but it's very, very easy, right, in Thailand and the Philippines, because there's a huge economic discrepancy, right, between countries of the West, Europe, the US, right, and Southeast Asian countries, right? So these girls, they're already enamored with foreigners, right, just by the fact that they represent a possible escape from poverty, essentially, right? So these girls are interested, one, because movies and everything, they see foreigners everywhere and they're always like the love interests, right? But also, in the back of their mind, or maybe very consciously, they're hoping to be pulled out of their situation, their upbringing, right, and be whisked away like a princess, right, to a better future, basically, right? And of course, you can't blame them for it, right? It sounds great, right? But in Japan, there's a very strong economy, and there's a huge middle class, right? So most girls are not thinking in the same way, like, I wish some foreigner would come whisk me away to a land of security and stability. On the contrary, a lot of foreigners in Japan have jobs that are not as stable and they're not as well off as actual Japanese people, right? Japanese, salarymen or whatever, right? So in their mind, getting whisked off would be getting whisked off by like a young Japanese shacho or CEO or something, right? So in their minds, their dream is more conceptualized as a Japanese man rather than as a foreigner, right? So in order to bridge the gap, right, essentially, you have to be able to relate to these Japanese women as a Japanese man does, right? And you're not copying a Japanese man, right? Because you'll never, unless you are actually Japanese, you're never going to be exactly like that. But there are certain ways in which they interact slightly differently from the West, right? And if you can understand that, you're much closer to hooking up with that demographic of girls, the more attractive ones that get selected for the more Japanese and kind of almost anti-foreigner vibe, right? And I really think it is kind of an uphill battle in the sense that a lot of these girls, not only are they not interested in foreigners, they're actively like disinterested, right? Now, why might that be? Well, in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, Japanese culture got super popular based around like anime, Dragon Ball, Sailor Moon, right? Pokemon, these kinds of things. So the type of guys who were interested in, type of foreigners who were interested in and coming to Japan are basically like very nerdy guys, right? And I'm thinking there's this one comic, right? I'll have to pull it up, but I'll put the link somewhere or maybe show it. But there's the comic basically goes like, back in his homeland in North America, he was shy, introverted, nerdy boy, but he comes to Japan and he's charisma man, right? Like, so the idea is that all of the foreigners, or a lot of the foreigners coming over to Japan, were sort of like nerdy, shy guys, right? Not like the coolest people in the world, right? No offense to nerds, I love nerds, I am a nerd, but when they come over, right, first of all, they haven't had much just general socialization, right? So, and second of all, they haven't had a lot of girlfriends, right? So they end up just like meeting whatever average sort of plain Jane type Japanese girls, right? And this pattern kind of reinforces the image in the Japanese people's mind of foreigners as generally low-paid English teachers who are kind of nerdy and interested in anime and date very mediocre Japanese girls, right? So, in other words, most foreigners are low status in Japan compared to other Asian countries, right? Or even Europe. If you're a foreigner in Europe, you're seen usually as like on the same level. Like if you're from the US and you go to Europe, for example, right? But it's not quite the same in Japan, right? So you have to calibrate everything to this, right? Cool. So are Japanese girls easy? And once again, I have to say that if you're in a foreign country, right, and if you meet them, like in Sydney or Vancouver or San Francisco, if you meet them in a Western country, most likely they're very interested in foreigners, and so of course they're more easy, right, than the ones who are in Japan. For the ones who are in Japan and very attractive and kind of doted on by Japanese society, I think you might have a little bit of an uphill struggle compared to what your expectations might be. But there are a bunch of ways that you can make yourself more relatable to Japanese women. And it starts with trying to understand them.